Hello, this is going to be our last rounding lesson for a little while, and we're going to recap what we've done so far and then cover rounding to a given number of decimal places. So just to remind ourselves where we're up to, we can round to the nearest 10, 100 or 1,000. We're going to look at the end today about rounding a number to the nearest 10,000 or 100,000. Last lesson we looked at estimating and checking calculations by rounding. We've covered rounding a decimal to the nearest whole number. Today we're rounding a decimal to a given number of decimal places, and last lesson as well we looked at solving context problems by rounding. So we're just finishing off today. So what we need to remind ourselves is, why do we round and how do we do it? So the reason why we round numbers, remember, is because it's not always helpful to have the full accurate number. Sometimes it's easier to work with and easier to get an idea of the size of a number if it doesn't have all the detail in it. So we round numbers in effect to make them less accurate, but to make them easier to understand and to keep them more relevant. Now, how do we do it? We talk about rounding up and rounding down. So remember, our process for rounding is we need to identify the digit, first of all, that is going to be rounded. So for example, if we were going to round the number 2,348 to the nearest 10, then we need to identify the tens digit. Sometimes it helps when you're saying the number out loud. Sometimes it helps to think about your columns. Remember, we've done all this in previous lessons. So if we're rounding to the nearest 10, we identify our tens digit, which in this case is the 4. And then we look at the 8, and it's the 8 that tells us whether we leave the 4 as a 4 or whether we move it up to a 5, because 2,348 is in between 2,340 and 2,350 if we're looking at numbers in the 10 times table. So remember, our process is you'd find the number that you want to round, and then the one that follows that, if that is a 0, 1, 2, 3 or 4, you leave the number as it is. And if it's a 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9, you round up. Okay? So it's not a case of rounding down and rounding up, because sometimes talking about rounding down can be a bit confusing. So we either leave the digit in question as it is, or we move it up one. So in our case, we've got an 8 here. So 8 belongs to this half, so we move up. That means we move the 4 up to a 5. In other words, we get 2,350. Now you've got to remember these zeros on the end. When we're looking at this, 2,348, if we change that 4 to a 5, but we forget about the 0 on the end, we'd have 235. And that is not a representation of 2,348. So you've got to keep the other digits meaning the same as they did before. Okay, so we looked at rounding to the nearest whole number. So this will lead us on quite nicely to our rounding to decimal places. So we'll look at that just now. So if we're rounding to the nearest whole number, for example, 293.472. So if we're rounding to the nearest whole number, we're rounding to the nearest unit, in other words. And the unit is the one straight in front of the decimal point. We look at the 4 and we look at our rounding rules here. 4 is in the leave section. So we leave the 3 as it is. We don't round it up one. So our answer here is just 293. Okay, remember, you can look back at the previous videos to help you remember what we did if you need to. Okay, So when we're rounding, just the things to bear in mind is you identify the number or the digit that you're rounding, and then you look at the one after that and it'll tell you whether you leave your digit as it is or whether you move it up one. Okay, one more practice. We'll round 70,293 to the nearest 100. Okay, so the hundreds digit, say it out loud, remember, 70,293, so 200. So the 2 is the hundreds digit. We look at the 9 because it follows the 2. The 9 is in this section here, so we round the 2 up to a 3. So we get 703. But we must remember that this 2 that we've rounded to a 3, that stood for 200, so that's got to stand for 300. Okay, the only way to make that happen is to stick the extra zeros on the end. Okay, so 70,300 is an approximation for 70,293. Now, what we're going on to next is rounding to decimal places. Now, we need to recap on decimals before we do this. So, I've got here some diagrams that will help us to think about decimals. If we wanted to represent decimals, then, for example, we might look at the number, let's say 1.6, okay? So 1.6 means 1 whole one and 6 tenths. So let's just recap those columns. So we've got units, tens, hundreds and thousands. After the units come the tenths, then the hundredths, and then the thousandths, and the 10,000ths, and so on. Okay? So 1.6 means 1 whole one and 6 tenths. Okay? We can represent that in a diagram by shading in 1 whole one and then 6 tenths. Okay? So that represents 1.6 if we just take those two rectangles there, because each of these rectangles is split into 10 pieces. So 6 tenths must be 6 out of those 10 coloured in. Okay? If we wanted to represent 7.4, then we would be shading in 7 of these whole ones. And we'd have 0.4, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4 tenths. Okay, so that's what the first decimal place would mean. Okay, it's tenths. So if we just stick to numbers less than 1 just now, if we think about 0.2, so as we've been looking at here in our diagram a moment ago, 0.2 can be represented by 2 out of 10. So this is 1 whole one here, this whole rectangle that's been split into 10 pieces, and we've chosen 2 of them, so it's 2 tenths. Now, what I want us to do is just look at that a bit bigger here, because we're going to move even further into decimals. Okay, so these big ones here, these are tenths. Okay, because this and this are the same, I've just made this bigger. Okay, now if we want to move into hundredths, then hundredths are a tenth of a tenth. Okay, so when we move into the next decimal place, we're taking one of these tenths and we're splitting it into 10 pieces as well. So these pink ones here, these are hundredths. Okay, so the whole rectangle would be a whole one. The individual boxes are tenths, and these tiny ones here are hundredths. So what we've got in this diagram is we've got no complete whole ones. So there's our 0, 0.2, because that's 2 tenths. And then we've got 3 hundredths shaded here in pink as well. So this diagram here represents the number 0.23. Okay, and we need to talk about decimal places because we're going to round to a number of decimal places. Right, now the number of decimal places is quite straightforward. It's just the amount of digits after the decimal point. So we're going to write this down just now. So can you write this in your books? Okay. Write down the amount of decimal places is the amount of digits after the decimal point. So if you need to pause to write that down, that's okay. But you make a note of that because it's going to be important. So the amount of decimal places is the amount of digits after the decimal point. So this number here, 0.23, has 2 decimal places because it's got 2 figures or 2 digits after the decimal point. So it's important to know that numbers can have any amount of decimal places. There are some numbers which are decimals that go on forever, okay? And they never stop, they just keep going with more and more decimal places. We're just going to have a look at these numbers here and see how many decimal places each number has. So the first number, 3.59, remember all we're doing for the amount of decimal places is counting how many digits are after the decimal point. So we've got 1, 2. So that one's got 2 decimal places, which we can write as 2dp. Okay, dp for decimal places. The next one, 4.082, has got 3 decimal places. 175.30, it's got 2 numbers after the decimal point, so it has got 2 decimal places, and it doesn't matter that one of those is 0, it still counts as a decimal place. It's very important that we remember that zeros count for decimal places. Okay, next one, 1920.0. We've got just 1 number after the decimal point, so we've got 1 decimal place there. And then the last one, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 digits after the decimal point, so that number has 4 decimal places. Okay, so that's the first step, is being able to identify how many decimal places a number has got. So now we're going to look at rounding to decimal places. And first of all, we're going to round to 1 decimal place. So what that means is when we've finished, our number should have 1 decimal place or 1 number after the decimal point. And the way that we do this is quite straightforward. It's following everything that we've been doing already. Okay, so if we're rounding to 1 decimal place, we need to identify the number that is in the first decimal place. So that's the one that follows the decimal point. So in this case, it's 7. So when we've finished rounding this, it's either going to say 14.7 or 14.8. And it's the 2 that tells us whether we leave the 7 as it is or move it up to an 8. And I'll just remind us of our rounding rule. Okay, so because the 2 is in this section, it means we leave the 7 as it is, and therefore our answer to this one is just 14.7. Now we must not put any more zeros after that. We must not give any more decimal places because we've been asked to round to 1 decimal place. So our answer can only have 1 number after the decimal point. If we put zeros on here to fill in for these numbers, we've actually just done it wrong. Okay, if it says 1 decimal place, that's what your answer must have. Okay, so the next one, 209.0 0.54. So we're rounding to one decimal place. So it's the first number after the decimal point. The 4 tells us to leave the 5 as it is. So when we round 209.54 to one decimal place, we just get 209.5. Okay, remember nothing else after that because your answer has to have one decimal place. And on to the next one, 160.0831, rounding to one decimal place. It's the 0 that we're rounding and it's the 8 that tells us what to do with it. So because the 8 is in this section here, it's in the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so we round up. So that means that this 0 moves up to a 1. So it's 160.1. Okay, and then the next one, 55.964. Well, the number in the first decimal place is the 9, and the 6 tells us to move this up. So remember, if we're going up one decimal place at a time, or if we're going up in tenths, we would have, for example, if we were counting, we'd have 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, or if we started somewhere else, we might have 26.7, 26.8, 26.9. What comes after 26.9? It's not 26.10, is it? That doesn't make sense. Okay, remember once you get to 9/10, if we just look at this, come back here. If we filled up to 9/10, once we do an extra one, we've got another whole one, haven't we? So when we move 55.9 up one, like we're looking at here, or if we were moved 26.9 up one, if you're moving 26.9 up one, 1/10, it goes 27.0. So when we are rounding this up, rounding the 9 up, instead of being 55.9, it becomes 56.0. Okay, just think about this number as 55 of those whole ones, and then 9/10, but when we make it into 10/10, that actually gives us another whole one, so it's 56, and then we've got no spare tenths. Okay. Now, I want you to pause the video and round each of these numbers to one decimal place. So remember, the process is you identify the number that's in the first decimal place. So let's look at the first one. That would be the 8. And then the 2 tells you whether to leave that 8 as an 8 or move it up to a 9. So whichever way you're doing it, your number is going to be it'll either be 4.8 or 4.9, and you've to decide that. Okay, the 2 tells you, remember, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, you leave it as it is, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you round up. So pause the video just now and round each number to one decimal place. And remember, if you're not sure, you can watch the previous bit of the video again, or you can just ask either your teacher or an adult that's nearby. Okay, so pause the video and get on with that. And here come the answers now. So check your work. So make sure that each of your numbers has only one number after the decimal point. Okay, if you've got more than one number after the decimal point, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. It's wrong because you haven't rounded it to one decimal place. Okay, so stick completely to one number after the decimal point. So pause it and mark those. Right, now we're going to look at rounding to 2 or 3 decimal places, because the process is exactly the same regardless of how many decimal places we're rounding to. So first of all, we're going to look at rounding to 2 decimal places. We've got a few numbers here to do. So 2 decimal places means we need 2 numbers after the decimal point. So if we count 1, 2, then it's the number in the second decimal place that we're rounding, and it's the number that follows that tells us whether we leave it or move it up 1. I'm writing the same thing as I've written on several bits so far. So the 3 either stays as a 3 here, or it moves up to a 4. And the 9 tells us it has to move up to a 4. So when we round 17.4398 to 2 decimal places, we get 17.44. And we can just check that we've got 2 digits after the decimal point, which is what we need for 2 decimal places. Okay, right, looking at the next one. 215.55555. All right, so we're rounding to 2 decimal places. So we need to identify the number in the second decimal place. So that's the first decimal place. That's the second decimal place. So it's the 5 here that we're rounding. And it's that 5 that tells us, when we look over here, that we must move up. We must round up. So what that means is that our 215.55555 becomes 215 point. The first 5 stays as it is, and the second 5 moves up to a 6. So we've got 2 decimal places in our answer there. Next one, 5,049.63921. The second decimal place is occupied by this 3 here. So the 9 that follows it tells us to round that 3 up to a 4. So we get 5,049.64. Okay, and the last one to 2 decimal places. We've got zeros here, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so when we're counting 1, 2, that 0 is in the second decimal place. And the 7 tells us whether we leave that 0 as a 0 or whether we move it up to a 1. And because 7 is in this section of the numbers, then we need to move the 0 up to a 1. So what that will give us to 2 decimal places is 0.01. So you can see when we're rounding to 2 decimal places that every answer has got to have 2 numbers after the decimal point. Likewise for 3 decimal places, this will not be a surprise to you. Again, I'm just going to write my 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 there, just to help us. So 3 decimal places means we're looking at the third number after the decimal point and deciding whether to leave that as it is or change it to the next number up by rounding it up. So 3 decimal places. So we need to count now. 1, 2, 3. So it's that 9 there that's in the third decimal place at the moment. Okay. Now you might notice that these are the same digits, same numbers, to start with, as we had to 2 decimal places. Okay. So we're rounding to 3 decimal places. So the 9 is in the third decimal place and the 8 tells us to move it up 1. And remember from before, if we're moving a 9 up 1, it actually has a knock-on effect to the next number, because if you think about just looking at this bit here, we're moving 39 up to 40. Okay, so what we get there when we round up is 17.440. Okay, that's a slightly tricky one that I've stuck in there at the beginning. But remember, what we've done there is the 8 told us to round this 9 up. The only way we can round that 9 up is by moving on 1, like when we're carrying numbers when we're adding. Okay, so it became 440, 3 decimal places. Okay, right, the next one, we're going to look at our 215.55555, and the third decimal place is that 5 there. So this 5 tells us whether we have to leave this one as it is or move it up to a 6. And of course we need to move it up to a 6 So we get 215 point, so if we just have a look, we've got these two 5s anyway. And then the third one, this one, remember, has to move up to a 6. And the next one. 5049.63921. So the 9 is in the third decimal place this time. The 2 tells us to leave the 9 as it is. So we get 5049.639. Just 2 more to go. So the next one, 0.05239. So the number in the third decimal place is 1, 2, 3. It's that 2. The 3 following it tells us we leave the 2 as it is. So when we round it, we get 0.052. Okay, we mustn't miss out these zeros here. They're very important. We've still got 3 decimal places, even though one of the digits is 0. Just like here, one of the digits was 0, but that's fine, as long as we've got 3 decimal places. And then the last one, the third decimal place, 1, 2, 3 is a 0. And the 4 tells us to leave that as it is. So we get 0.000. Okay, so that's it rounded to 3 decimal places. It is 0.000, which maybe looks a bit odd, but it's showing us that we've given it to 3 decimal places. Okay, so well done if you've managed to keep up with all that, and you're going to do some practicing just now. So what I would like you to do now is round each number to the correct number of decimal places. So what I've done is beside each number, I've put how many decimal places I want you to round it to. So the first number here, 4.03296, I want you to round to 2 decimal places. So that's going to mean you count 1, 2 after the decimal point. And then you're going to use that 2 to decide whether your answer is 4.03 or 4.04. And remember, you need to use this to help you decide. Okay, so pause the video just now and round all those to the correct number of decimal places. So here we have the answers, all rounded to the number of decimal places that was specified in the question. So take a moment, pause the video again and check your answers. And now we've just got one more bit to look at. I hope you did well with those ones. The only thing that we've not looked at yet, that we're not going to spend very long on, is rounding to the nearest 10,000 and 100,000. Okay, so we're just going to do a couple of examples of these. Remember right at the beginning of the lesson today, we had to identify the tens digit when we were rounding to the nearest 10. So if we're rounding to the nearest 10,000, then it's the 10,000 digit that we need to identify. So we're going to look at rounding these numbers to the nearest 10,000 to start with. So our columns go, I'm just going to make this bigger so we can see, go units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. So it's the 4 in this case that is the 10,000s digit. So the 5 tells us whether we leave the 4 as it is or move it up to a 5. So we're going to have to move it up to a 5, aren't we? So that becomes 5. This 4 here becomes a 5. But we're rounding to the nearest 10,000, and 5 is not a number to the nearest 10,000, is it? So we need to make sure we've got the right number of zeros in. So to hold this 5 in the 10,000s column, we're going to need 4 zeros after it, because we've got to have a 0 in each of these 4 columns. So 45,328 is rounded up to 50,000. Okay. The next number, we're going to round to the nearest 10,000 as well. So we're going to identify the 10,000s digit. So again, we've got units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. That would be 100,000s, running out of space, and this one is millions. Okay, so we need the 10,000s digit. That's the 8, and the 4 tells us whether we leave that 8 as an 8. Actually, I'm just going to undo that, underline it instead. So we leave the 8 as an 8, or we move it up to a 9, and it's this 4, it's always the digit immediately after that tells you what to do. So the 4 tells you to leave that 8 as it is, so we get 7, 2, 8, but we've got to keep that 8, meaning 8 lots of 10,000, so it's 80,000, so 80,000. Okay, you've got to keep the number that you've rounded 5 in, so that it becomes the 10,000s digit. Okay, the next one, we're going to round to the nearest 100,000. Okay, so if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all right, so it's going to be the 6th and 1 in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that 7 is the 100,000s digit in this number. By the way, this number says 298,701,556. So the 7 is in the 100,000s place, and the 0 that follows it tells you to leave it as a 7. So when we round that to the nearest 100,000, we get 2, 9, 8, 7, and then the rest have to be filled in with zeros. So 298,700,000. Okay, so that's when we're rounding really big numbers to the nearest 10,000 or 100,000. We can actually round any number to any degree of accuracy. Okay, we can round big numbers, small numbers, decimals. You've seen it all across these 4 lessons, and now we just need to check our learning outcomes and make sure we're where we want it to be by the end. So here we are. We've rounded numbers to the nearest 10, 100 or 1,000. We've rounded to the nearest 10,000 or 100,000. We only touched on that a little bit. We were estimating and checking calculations by rounding in the same lesson as we were solving context problems by rounding. We've looked at rounding a decimal to the nearest whole number, and today we've looked at rounding decimals to a given number of decimal places. And remember, decimal places was abbreviated to DP. So well done. You should have a good understanding of rounding now. Remember, if you've got any questions, you just need to ask. So well done. I'll see you soon.